The spit landed not with a splatter, but with a silence. It hung in the air for half a second longer than gravity should have allowed, as if the moment itself didn't want to arrive. But it did. It landed, wet, deliberate, and slow, on the unmoving face of a man who'd been trained to endure worse without flinching. He didn't flinch now. Not even a blink. There was no gasp. Not at first. Only that strange, heavy kind of silence that wraps itself around a crowd when something crosses a line none of them were brave, or foolish, enough to cross themselves. Phones were already up, of course. People filming the square because that's what you do in front of Buckingham Palace. But those who had only just hit record, missed it. Those who caught it, stopped filming almost immediately. That's the thing with real moments. When they arrive, you want to witness them with your eyes, not your screen. The man who spat, he laughed. Loud, nasal, smug. You could tell he thought it was hilarious. Like he'd done something daring. Something no one else would have had the nerve to try. But the man he spat on. Stillness. Utter stillness. Red coat. Black bearskin hat. Polished rifle. Perfect posture. That infamous, almost inhuman discipline. He didn't move a muscle. Didn't acknowledge the disrespect. Didn't wipe it away. He simply stood, silent and unwavering, as if the moment never happened. And maybe for him, it hadn't. In a square watched by the world, silence became the loudest sound. It wasn't the spit that shocked people, not really. It was the response. Or the lack of one. People expect retaliation. A reaction. A flicker of emotion. But this? This was something else. Something deeper. And it unsettled people in a way they couldn't quite name. Mothers whispered to their children to look away. A few tourists laughed, nervous, jittery laughter that dies quickly when no one joins in. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Why isn't he moving?" And the father, who seconds earlier had been chuckling at the man's antics, suddenly didn't feel like laughing anymore. The man in red just stood there. Unmoved. Unmoving. As if rooted to the stones beneath him, and loyal not to the man who spat on him, nor the crowd now whispering and wondering, but to something older. Something unseen. The sun hung low in the sky, late afternoon spilling gold across the palace facade, stretching shadows long and lean across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a tour guide's voice crackled over a speaker, continuing a history lesson no one was listening to anymore. Because something had shifted. Something you could feel more than see. He was just a guard, wasn't he? A living statue. A photo opportunity. A throwback to an empire that most of the world barely understood anymore. Just a guy in a fancy outfit doing a silly job that didn't really matter. That's what they thought. Until that moment. Until the silence. Because that's when the question began to gnaw. What if he could move? What if he would? And if he did, what then? The man who spat, his name was Gregory, though no one cared to know it at the time, kept posturing for the crowd. Puffing his chest out. Gesturing at the guard like he was a zoo animal refusing to perform. But the laughter had stopped. The energy had turned. A current now ran beneath the cobblestones, electric and invisible. You could feel it in the air. A moment waiting to happen. But what happened next wasn't caught by most cameras, because it didn't happen in the open. It happened in the pause. In the breath between now and what came after. And in that breath, the world turned. Two men stood in the square that day, but only one knew he was standing in a story. He stepped off the curb like he owned the city. Like London was just another backdrop in a life that had been nothing but velvet ropes and VIP passes. You could tell from the way he moved, chest out, shoulders loose, that smug lean forward like the world was late to meet him. The kind of man who doesn't ask if a place is sacred before stepping into it. He assumes he belongs, no matter where he lands. And as he strutted into the frame that day, with his mirrored sunglasses and a camera crew of 2 flunkies trying to keep up, no one imagined he'd end up being the villain in a story he thought he was directing. Gregory Whitman was rich. Not rich like money in the bank rich like coastlines and senators in his contacts list. The kind of rich that makes you forget you were ever ordinary. He'd made his fortune flipping companies, carving up businesses like steaks at a private dinner, then bragging about it online to an audience that mistook cruelty for charisma. That's what the internet does. It amplifies confidence until it sounds like truth. And Gregory knew it. He sold the image of a winner, a disruptor, the guy who tells it like it is, even if what he told was hollow. He wore disrespect like cologne. Strong. Expensive. Overpowering. David, on the other hand, didn't look like much. Not at first. That's the point of the uniform. It flattens a man. It erases his name, his past, his story. The red coat is louder than the man inside it. It was designed that way. Centuries ago, when they wanted enemies to know what country they were dying against. But underneath that tall bearskin hat and polished brass, there was a man who'd seen more than most people could survive. He'd served in places that never made the news. Done things that would never be written down. And then, after all of that, he chose this job. A job where stillness is sacred. Where silence is strength. He had a name, though no one called it. David Huxley. Raised by his grandfather after a roadside bomb made him an orphan at 10. His grandfather was military too, Royal Marines, and taught David the kind of discipline that lives in your bones. Not the angry kind. The patient kind. The kind that teaches you to see the world clearly before deciding whether to step forward or stay still. David never chased glory. He chased precision. He found comfort in rituals, laced the boots this way, breathe in on the left foot, out on the right. And when the world got too loud, too complicated, he turned to the one job where silence was not only respected, but revered. There was a man watching all of this from a bench just across the square. Not filming. Not speaking. Just watching. People didn't notice him because that's what he was good at, disappearing in plain sight. His name was Mac, though no one knew his full name. Everyone called him that. He was old enough to be part of history, but sharp enough to notice history being made. Mac wasn't a tourist. He wasn't even a bystander. He was a man who had worn the same uniform once, decades ago, back when the Cold War kept London tense. He came here sometimes to watch the younger guards. To see if the line still held. If the tradition still meant something. Mac noticed Gregory before anyone else did. Not because he was loud, though he was, but because Mac had seen that kind of man before. The kind who mistook stillness for weakness. The kind who thought volume could win against dignity. Gregory wasn't new. He was ancient, really. A walking echo of arrogance. And Mac leaned forward on his cane, sighed once, and muttered, "Here we go," like someone bracing for a storm that's been forecast for hours. He knew something most people didn't. Stillness doesn't mean surrender. It means control. And control, when tested, has its own kind of violence. Gregory's crew set up their shot like it was a prank video. He walked into frame, arms out, already narrating his own entrance. "Here we are, folks," he said into the lens, "London's famous Buckingham Palace. Land of tea, crumpets, and emotionless statues in funny hats." He winked. His followers would love that. They always did. He'd built his brand on mockery. Mocking waiters, mocking hotel clerks, mocking traditions he didn't understand. And now, he'd decided, it was the Queen's Guard's turn. His followers wanted a reaction. And Gregory never disappointed the people who liked their entertainment with a side of humiliation. He walked right up to David. Close. Too close. But David didn't move. That was the rule. And Gregory smirked at that. He circled once, hands behind his back, like he was inspecting a museum piece. "I've got to say," he drawled, "for a guy whose job is to stand still, you're doing an exceptional job of it." He leaned in, inches from David's face. "Do you blink?" "I bet you blink. Come on, blink for the camera. Give the people what they want." David didn't blink. He didn't even breathe heavier. He simply stared ahead, eyes forward, heart steady. The crowd wasn't laughing. Not really. A few chuckles here and there, but mostly just unease. It's uncomfortable to watch someone test a line you weren't brave enough to cross yourself. And even more uncomfortable to watch them do it without consequence, at least not immediately. Some tourists started walking away. A few stayed, hoping it would blow over. But one child asked his mother, "Why is he being mean to the soldier?" The mother didn't answer. She was watching David. Watching to see if he would break. Gregory kept pushing. He mimed ridiculous faces beside David, danced mockingly, even tried placing his phone in the guard's pocket until one of his lackeys whispered that it might technically be assault. Gregory laughed it off. "Relax, I'm just giving the guy a little screen time." He didn't know who he was dealing with. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He thought the uniform was a costume. He thought the silence was emptiness. He thought the job was a joke. What he didn't understand was that behind the red coat was a man who had been tested in fire long before today. David stood as he always did. Perfect posture. Chin level. Breath timed with the ancient rhythm of guard duty. But inside, something stirred. Not anger. Not even disgust. Just clarity. That kind of clarity soldiers learn when they realize the enemy in front of them isn't dangerous, just reckless. Gregory didn't need to be punished. He needed to be revealed. And David understood, in that moment, that doing nothing would do exactly that. Mac leaned back on the bench and let out a slow exhale. He didn't need to check his watch to know what time it was. He'd been watching long enough to know that something had shifted. The crowd might not see it. Gregory certainly didn't. But Mac did. There's a point in every confrontation when the weight of arrogance tips. When the act becomes transparent. When the silence starts to feel like judgment. Gregory had reached that point, and hadn't even noticed. And that was the mistake. Because some men wait their whole lives to be seen. Others are content with never being known, as long as they do what's right when it matters. Gregory Whitman thought he was the main character. The camera made him believe it. But what he didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Buckingham Palace doesn't need characters. It needs guardians. And guardians don't perform. They endure. And if the moment calls for it, they answer. Provocation, like a slow poison, seeps before it stings. He started small. That's how it usually goes. People like Gregory don't crash through doors, they test the hinges. First came the jokes, low-hanging fruit about the uniform, the hat, the motionless stance. He made faces behind the guard's back, strutted up and down like a poorly cast theater villain. His crew giggled, half because it was funny and half because they knew they were supposed to laugh. But no one else joined in. Not really. The tourists were watching, unsure of where this was going, caught in that uncomfortable limbo between curiosity and secondhand shame. Even the pigeons gave the man space, as if they, too, sensed something was shifting in the air. The square felt heavier, as if the ground was slowly tilting. The guard, David, stood exactly as he had before. Not a muscle moved. But now his stillness had weight to it, like a wall. Gregory circled him, narrating each step into the camera like a host on some grotesque travel show. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is one of Britain's finest mannequins," he said, puffing his chest out and mimicking the stance. They say he can't talk, can't move, can't even blink. But I don't buy it. He leaned close to the guard's face, a breath away. Let's test the theory, shall we? There's a difference between acting like you're in control and actually being in control. Gregory had no idea he'd already lost the room. The laughter he thought he'd earned was nervous now, scattered and quiet. A father shifted his daughter behind him. An older woman whispered, disgraceful. But Gregory didn't hear any of it. He was too busy narrating his own performance, eyes locked on his camera lens, not the people around him. His world was a performance bubble. He thought as long as he controlled the camera, he controlled the scene. What he didn't realize was that people weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the man he was trying to provoke. David remained still, but not invisible. Something about him had begun to change, not visibly, not physically, but in presence. It's hard to describe unless you've felt it, but stillness can become a form of power when held long enough. The longer he didn't react, the more certain people became that he could. That this wasn't weakness or passivity. It was endurance. The kind of restraint that can only come from a lifetime of practicing it. Gregory mistook it for indifference. But everyone else was starting to see it for what it was, discipline. And not the easy kind. The dangerous kind. Two young boys near the front started whispering. One asked if the man in red was going to explode. The other shook his head, eyes wide. No, he's a soldier, he said. Soldiers don't explode. But even he sounded like he wasn't quite sure anymore. That's the thing about tension, it crawls under your skin before you even know it's there. Every movement Gregory made now felt amplified. Every smirk, every step, every insult carried more weight. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. And no one, not even Gregory, understood what they were waiting for. A woman with a stroller called out to Gregory, asking him to stop. Her voice cracked a little, the kind of sound that says you're not just annoyed, you're afraid. But Gregory brushed it off. Relax, lady, he called over his shoulder, it's just a joke. He laughed again, the same empty laugh he always used when someone didn't get the bit. Only this time, no one echoed it. The crowd had grown cold around him, arms folded, expressions tight. Even his own crew had stopped filming, glancing at each other like they were rethinking how far they'd come along for this ride. Then he crossed the invisible line. He stepped too close. Stood in the guard's space. Their chests nearly touched. He tilted his head, mocking. Whispered something no one else heard. And still, no response. David's eyes stayed fixed forward, but something behind them had shifted. The crowd didn't see it, not exactly, but they felt it. Like a current passing through the stone beneath their feet. Like the air had thickened by a degree. Gregory didn't notice. He never noticed what didn't serve him. He pulled a folded Union Jack from his pocket, thin, plastic, probably bought from a souvenir cart, and wiped it across his brow like a napkin. He pretended to sneeze into it, then laughed at his own show. But no one else laughed. Not even the pigeons flinched now. The moment had stretched too far. It had stopped being entertainment long ago. Mac, still watching from the bench, shook his head once and said, softly, he's walking blind into a lesson. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. Just to himself. Or maybe to the ghosts of men he once stood beside. Ghosts who understood that dignity, once provoked too far, doesn't shout. It waits. Gregory turned back to the crowd, desperate now. His eyes were wide, not scared yet, but confused. The crowd wasn't giving him what he wanted. He waved his arms. Come on, folks, don't be so uptight. It's just a bit of fun. You think he cares? He's not even real. His voice had started to rise, a defensive pitch. The confidence cracked around the edges. And David, through it all, didn't so much as shift his weight. That was what made it so powerful. Not the silence, but the totality of it. Gregory was throwing stones into a black lake and not even hearing a splash. Finally, he said the line. The one he wouldn't be able to walk back from. You're just a guy in a costume. A prop. A puppet. I bet even your gun's fake. He reached for the rifle slung across David's shoulder, just enough to touch the strap. A ripple moved through the crowd, like wind over tall grass. Max sat forward now, eyes sharp. The world paused. For a moment, it wasn't Buckingham Palace. It wasn't a square filled with tourists. It was a stage. And everyone on it held their breath, wondering what the final act would be. David didn't move. Not yet. But the spell had changed. What was once provocation had become confrontation. And what had been stillness was now silence holding a blade. Discipline is not weakness. It's the moment before thunder. It happened in the space between two heartbeats. Not with rage. Not with violence. But with something far more terrifying, precision. Gregory had turned his back, muttering something to his crew, still trying to salvage the wreckage of his performance. He thought it was over. That the guard had given him his moment, and now the crowd would move on. But that was the mistake. Because what Gregory had never understood, what so many never do, is that silence is not submission. Stillness is not surrender. And some things wait. Not because they're afraid, but because they choose when to respond. And now, the moment had arrived. Not with fury, but with finality. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just watched as the man in red moved for the second time that day. Not much. Just enough. A single step, then another. Measured, deliberate, impossible to misread. Gregory felt it before he saw it, like a change in temperature. He turned, expecting a continuation of nothing. But instead, he was met with a pair of eyes, not wild, not angry, but steady. Eyes that had seen things far worse than him. Eyes that did not flinch. Eyes that did not blink. For the first time in his life, Gregory looked into the face of someone who didn't care who he was. The sound of David's boots against the stone echoed louder than any words. That rhythm, so clean, so assured, cut through the tension like a blade. He closed the distance, not in a rush, but with certainty. Not a man out for revenge, but a man fulfilling a promise. Gregory stumbled back, tripping slightly on the edge of the curb. There was no camera now. No script. No audience in the way he understood them. Just people. Watching. Waiting. Holding their breath. Because even though David hadn't spoken a word, the world had already changed its opinion about who held the power here. Gregory tried to speak, his hands raised halfway like he wasn't sure whether to surrender or joke. "Hey, look, I didn't mean anything by it," he said, voice too high, too fast. "It was just a laugh, all right? Just content. You know how this works." But David said nothing. That was the part that frightened Gregory the most. He was used to yelling. To arguments. To backlash. He knew how to handle fury. But this wasn't fury. It was control. And control that doesn't need to explain itself becomes something impossible to reason with. David stopped 2 feet away. That was all. He didn't raise his hand. Didn't touch him. Didn't even make a sound. But the silence between them was deafening. He looked at Gregory the way a mountain looks at a storm. Unmoved. And Gregory, sweating now, chest heaving, looked around for someone to intervene. But no one stepped forward. Not his crew. Not the tourists. Not the police, who had appeared at the edge of the square but hadn't yet crossed into the scene. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. Something that would make sense of what they were seeing. Then David did something no one expected. He raised his hand, not to strike, not to grab, but to point. One clean, simple gesture. He pointed to the ground at Gregory's feet. Not a word. Just a look. And then, slowly, the man in red turned. Not away from Gregory, but away from the moment. He returned to his post. Step by step. Breath by breath. Resetting the scene as if to say, you were never a threat. Just a reminder. A lesson. Nothing more. Gregory didn't move. Not at first. He stood there, frozen, lost inside the sound of his own heartbeat. His camera crew had stopped recording, their faces pale. Someone in the crowd coughed. Another muttered, well, that's the end of him. And maybe it was. Not in the dramatic way. Not with handcuffs or headlines. But in the quieter, deeper sense. The kind of ending where a man sees himself clearly for the first time and doesn't like what he finds. The kind where a mirror isn't glass, but a human being who refuses to be broken. Mac watched it all unfold with the stillness of a man who'd seen centuries collapse into moments like this. He didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just nodded once, as if to himself. He let him go, he whispered, though no one asked. Not because he had to. But because he could. And that was the difference. That was what set David apart from the kind of men who yell, or strike, or demand attention. His power wasn't in what he did. It was in what he chose not to do. The guards at Buckingham are not meant to react. That's what people say. That's the myth. But the truth is, they're trained to do far more than stand still. They are soldiers. Warriors dressed in pageantry. Their stillness isn't ignorance, it's capacity restrained. And when they do move, it's not by accident. It's not for show. It's for cause. That's what Gregory finally understood, standing there with nothing left to say. The uniform didn't make the man. The man made the uniform terrifying. He walked away eventually. Slowly. Shoulders hunched. Eyes on the ground. No exit music. No applause. Just a long, lonely shuffle out of a story he never controlled. His crew followed, unsure whether to keep the footage or delete it. They didn't talk about it on the way back. They wouldn't mention it in the next upload. Because some stories don't work in clips. Some truths don't get filtered through edits or thumbnails. They just sit with you, long after the scene fades, long after the views disappear. David stood at his post. Back straight. Hands resting perfectly on the rifle. Breath steady. It was like he'd never moved at all. But everyone watching knew better. They'd seen it. They'd felt it. That moment when silence became language. When presence became power. When a man spat on another and discovered he wasn't mocking a statue, he was provoking a storm. And storms don't need to speak. They arrive. They remind. And they leave. It wasn't the silence that lingered, it was the echo of what it meant. The square had emptied, but the moment hadn't. Even as the tourists dispersed, their conversations low and uncertain, the weight of what had transpired hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift. I remained seated on that bench, the coolness of the stone beneath me grounding, as if anchoring me to the reality of what I had just witnessed. The man in red stood motionless once more, his posture impeccable, yet there was a subtle shift, an imperceptible change that only those who had truly seen could recognize. It was in the set of his shoulders, the calm in his gaze, the unwavering presence that now carried a different kind of weight. Not just of duty, but of something deeper, earned respect. I found myself reflecting on the nature of engagement, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that commands it without uttering a word. In a world saturated with noise, where voices clamor to be heard, there is a profound power in restraint. The guard's response, or rather his measured lack thereof, spoke volumes. It was a masterclass in discipline, in the art of choosing one's battles, in understanding that true strength often lies in the ability to remain composed amidst provocation. This was not passivity, it was controlled power, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself because it is self-evident. And in that realization, I felt a shift within myself, a newfound appreciation for the quiet fortitude that often goes unnoticed. As I sat there, the city continued its rhythm around me. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional chirp of birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, all reminders that life moves forward. Yet, I remained still, allowing the moment to settle, to imprint itself upon my consciousness. I thought about the countless times I had walked past guards like him, barely acknowledging their presence, taking for granted the silent vigil they maintained. Today, that changed. Today, I saw not just a uniform, but the person within, the dedication, the sacrifice, the unwavering commitment to a role that demands so much and offers so little in return. The incident with Gregory had been a catalyst, a stark contrast between superficial bravado and genuine integrity. His antics, designed to elicit reactions and garner attention, had instead highlighted his own insecurities. In trying to diminish the guard, he had inadvertently exposed his own lack of substance. And the guard, by choosing not to retaliate, had demonstrated a level of maturity and strength that rendered Gregory's provocations impotent. It was a powerful reminder that dignity cannot be taken, it can only be surrendered. And this man had refused to surrender his. I began to consider the broader implications of what I had witnessed. In an era where reactions are immediate and often disproportionate, where the loudest voice is mistaken for the most authoritative, the guard's composure was a revelation. It challenged the prevailing narrative that to be heard, one must shout, to be seen, one must perform. Instead, it suggested that presence, when rooted in authenticity and purpose, is more impactful than any spectacle. This was not just a lesson in personal conduct but a commentary on societal values, a call to re-evaluate what we celebrate and why. The more I pondered, the more I realized that the guard's engagement was not with Gregory, but with a principle. He stood not in opposition to a man, but in alignment with a code, a set of standards that dictated his response. This adherence to principle over impulse was what set him apart. It was a form of engagement that transcended the immediate, connecting him to a lineage of service and honor. In that sense, his actions were not just his own but representative of a collective ethos. And in recognizing that, I felt a deep sense of respect, not just for him, but for all who embody such principles in their daily lives. As the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the square, I finally rose from the bench. I took one last look at the man in red, still as ever, a sentinel of resolve amidst the flux of the world. I nodded, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, though I knew he would not respond. That was not his role. But in that moment, I felt a connection, a shared understanding that sometimes, the most profound engagements are those that require no words, only presence. And with that, I turned and walked away, carrying with me a lesson etched not in dialogue, but in the quiet strength of a man who chose to stand his ground with grace. Some moments don't end when they're over. They echo. Long after the crowd had thinned and the square had returned to its usual rhythm, I found myself unable to leave. The image of the guard, stoic, composed, unwavering, remained etched in my mind. It wasn't just about the incident anymore, it was about what it represented. In a world where reactions are immediate and often impulsive, his restraint spoke volumes. I began to ponder the depth of training and discipline required to maintain such composure under provocation. This wasn't merely about standing still, it was about embodying a principle, a tradition, a commitment to duty that transcended personal emotion. Delving deeper, I discovered that the guards at Buckingham Palace are not just ceremonial figures, they are highly trained soldiers. Their preparation includes rigorous physical training, weapons handling, and even martial arts. They are taught to handle various situations, from dealing with nuisances to responding to potential threats. This level of preparedness ensures that they can maintain their composure, knowing they have the skills to handle any situation that may arise. It's a testament to their professionalism and dedication that they can stand motionless, exuding calm and authority, even when faced with disrespect. The more I learned, the more I appreciated the depth of their commitment. These guards undergo extensive training, including a 28-week course at the Infantry Training Center Catterick, where they master various skills essential for their role. Their duties are not limited to standing guard, they also participate in ceremonial events, requiring them to maintain impeccable appearance and conduct. Their shifts can last up to 48 hours, with periods of standing guard interspersed with rest. Despite the physical demands and the monotony, they remain vigilant, understanding the significance of their role in representing the monarchy and the nation. Reflecting on the incident, I realized that the guard's response was not just about personal restraint, it was about upholding the dignity of his position. By choosing not to react aggressively, he maintained the decorum expected of him, setting an example of professionalism. His actions conveyed a powerful message, that strength lies not in retaliation, but in control. In a society that often glorifies immediate reactions, his measured response was a reminder of the value of discipline and the importance of maintaining one's principles, even in the face of provocation. This incident also prompted me to consider the broader implications of such discipline. In our daily lives, we are often faced with situations that test our patience and composure. The guard's example serves as a lesson in the power of restraint and the impact of measured responses. It challenges us to rise above immediate impulses and to respond with thoughtfulness and integrity. His conduct exemplifies the idea that true strength is demonstrated not through dominance, but through the ability to remain steadfast in one's values. As I finally left the square, I carried with me a renewed respect for the guards and the principles they embody. Their presence is more than ceremonial, it is a symbol of dedication, discipline, and the enduring values that underpin their service. The incident, while unsettling, served as a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining one's composure and integrity, even when challenged. It reinforced the idea that our actions, especially in moments of adversity, define who we are. And in that quiet square, amidst the echoes of footsteps and fading conversations, I found a profound lesson in the silent strength of a man who chose dignity over reaction. The request came quietly, as all meaningful things often do. It wasn't broadcasted on social media, no camera crew hovered at the edges, waiting for a viral moment. Just a message delivered through the right channels, discreet, respectful, almost reluctant. Gregory Whitman wanted to see David Huxley. Not for content. Not for redemption. Not even for apology. Just, closure. Whatever that meant. He didn't expect forgiveness. Perhaps he didn't even want it. But something had shifted in him, something deep and unspoken, like a foundation cracking beneath years of assumed strength. And so he reached out, not as a provocateur, but as a man searching for understanding. They met in a small room behind the barracks, away from the public eye, away from the weight of symbolism and spectacle. No cameras. No crowd. Just two men seated across from each other, one in civilian clothes, the other still in uniform, though his post was miles away. The silence between them wasn't hostile, it was thoughtful, heavy with memory. Gregory's usual bravado was muted, his posture slouched rather than confident. You could see it in his eyes, he wasn't here to perform. He was here to ask a question that had been gnawing at him ever since that day in the square. A question he hadn't realized he needed answered until now. He looked at David, really looked at him, and finally saw what he hadn't that day. Not just the discipline or the training, but the choice. The control. That quiet, unshakable certainty that made David dangerous, not because he could hurt someone, but because he didn't have to. And in that realization, Gregory felt something unfamiliar. Not shame exactly, but awareness. A recognition of just how far off track he drifted, mistaking noise for power, applause for respect. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to begin. So he settled on the simplest words he could find. Why didn't you stop me? His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its usual arrogance. There was no accusation in it, no challenge. Just curiosity. Maybe even regret. I watched as David considered the question, not in the way most people do, searching for an answer, but in the way someone recalls a familiar path. He didn't hesitate. Didn't look away. Just took a breath, slow and steady, and gave a response so simple, yet so final, it landed heavier than any confrontation ever could. I did. Gregory blinked once, then twice, as if trying to parse a deeper meaning hidden within those two words. And maybe there was. Maybe David wasn't talking about that one step forward, that measured approach that silenced the square. Maybe he meant something wider, broader. Maybe he meant every second before that moment, the silence that refused to crack, the stance that never wavered, the refusal to let Gregory define the scene. Because restraint is a form of action. And David had already won long before he moved. He simply waited until the moment required acknowledgement. Gregory leaned forward, fingers interlaced, knuckles white. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it wasn't to argue. I thought I was in control, he admitted, voice quieter now, more reflective. I thought if I kept pushing, you'd break. That everyone breaks. His laugh wasn't smug this time. It was tired. Resigned. But you didn't. Not once. He shook his head, looking down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. And when you finally moved, it wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was finality. Like you were ending something I didn't know I started. David didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. What was there to say? Some lessons are best absorbed in silence. But after a pause, he offered a simple truth, spoken without flourish or intent to wound. Control isn't about proving yourself. It's about knowing who you are when no one's watching. He let that settle, letting Gregory feel the weight of it, not as a lecture, but as a mirror. You spent your whole life chasing attention. I spent mine learning when to give it, and when to withhold it. That's the difference. For the first time, Gregory didn't try to deflect. He just sat there, absorbing it, letting the truth linger in the space between them. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about understanding. About seeing himself clearly for once, instead of through the warped lens of performance. He thought back to the footage, the moments his team had captured, his posturing, his jokes, his attempt to provoke a reaction. And in the end, he realized that the only thing he had truly exposed was himself. Not the guard. Him. After a while, he stood. Slowly. Without ceremony. There was no handshake. No grand exit. Just a quiet nod, a gesture of acknowledgement neither man would mistake for acceptance. Gregory turned toward the door, pausing for just a second before stepping through. As he left, I noticed something different in his step, not humility, not yet, but awareness. A subtle shift, like a man walking away from a fire realizing how close he had come to burning himself beyond repair. David remained seated for a few minutes longer, alone in the small room, his expression unreadable. Not cold. Not warm. Simply present. He had done what he came to do, not confront, not punish, not humiliate. He had answered a question that had been asked, not in words, but in silence. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of response. We forget that silence isn't absence. It's presence held with purpose. And in that room, in that moment, David had spoken volumes without uttering a single word. As he stepped back into the world outside, the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the city. London was unchanged, indifferent to the meeting that had just taken place, but something in the air felt different. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just real. The kind of real that settles over you slowly, like dust after a storm has passed. David walked with his usual gait, measured and deliberate, returning to the square where it had all begun. Not to prove anything. Not to make a statement. Just to be where he always was. And Gregory? He disappeared into the streets, his footsteps quieter now, his presence less certain. He wouldn't upload this encounter. There would be no captions, no edits, no clever commentary. Just memory. Something private and personal, locked away in the part of him that didn't seek validation. People would wonder what happened between them. Some might speculate, others might ignore it entirely. But those who witnessed it knew better. They had seen something unfold that couldn't be explained in headlines or hashtags. Because some moments aren't meant to be performed. They're meant to be lived. And in living them, we learn the true weight of presence. You can't measure a man by what he lets you see. You measure him by what he refuses to show, until the moment demands it. And when it does, when he finally chooses to reveal it, that's when you understand. Silence isn't weakness. It's preparation. It's patience. It's restraint sharpened into something undeniable. And that's why David didn't flinch when the spit landed on his face. Because he knew something Gregory didn't, that real power isn't loud. It doesn't boast. It doesn't demand attention. It waits. And when the time comes, when the moment arrives, it doesn't need to prove itself. It simply moves. And in that movement, everything shifts. Respect isn't earned in noise. It's carved in silence. And in that silence, the loudest sound is the one that never comes.